and welcome back to the content room. I'm not as great and charming as Jeremy, but I'll try my best to be your host today. So we're back here after what I hope was a nice lunch, and back to talk about a lot about content and what's happening there, and what can we engage more, what can we do to be best communicators and marketers. And I've got a great group of panel with me today. Our moderator will be Samantha Glynne from FremantleMedia, VP Branded Entertainment, and I'll leave it to Samantha to introduce the rest of the panel and kick off the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Please come forward, because it's kind of weird as I shout to beanbags at the back of a room. And thank you for coming here before you rush to the airport. So I'm Sam Glynne, and I'm at FremantleMedia, and that's the production house that makes Got Talent, Idol, X Factor, and things like that. But I look after our relationships with brands and how we create content. And with me, I've got an interesting panel. I've got Ansel Araujo.
You said right, yeah.
Thank you very much. And he's Vice President Global Creative at Storyful, based in New York. Angela over here, Angela Everitt, she's Director of Creative Strategy at The Economist magazine. And then we've got Jakob Stiegler, who's the founder of Mano, and that's quite a recent new company. When we got the title of this panel, we struggled to kind of find a point of view that we could cover in 20 minutes. So although it is relevance and content, where do big ideas come from, getting deeper engagement with consumers with reliable content, what we're really going to talk about is how a big idea can be in context and solve brands' problems. So I think I'll jump straight in and say, big idea, because it's a phrase we bandy around a lot. What is a big idea, and how is it a solution to help brands and their audiences understand what the brand's trying to say? Ansel?
I think I can start with another question, right?
Go on.
So is a big idea supposed to be that big, right? I think we always think of big idea based on the scale of what a big idea is and how long it takes on the process of creating it. But we are in a fast-paced environment today where social media is a thing, right? And we are on it. And we have seen some ideas that were on social media that were not apparently that big or didn't take that long to create, yet caused a huge impact on the way that it was implemented, and on what kind of changes it was able to create, and how it somehow changed the way that people are behaving on social media. So at Storyful, we create social campaigns. They're driven by user-generated content. And the power of what we create is what we go for, right? Not how big it is your campaign, the bigger the better, but it's the impact that it can cause, right, on a media campaign. But everybody in the panel has a different opinion about it. Some people think that big idea has to be as big as possible.
Yeah. And I don't think I could represent The Economist without being a cheerleader for the big idea, for elevating something beyond the mediocre and the mundane. I think the internet is awash with mediocre content, and that really annoys me. I think there's nothing wrong with, and to your point, the big idea doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, the best ideas are the most simple ones. They're the elegant ones. They're the ones that you can describe in a couple of sentences. Because if I can't elevate or pitch you an idea and you'll get it, then it's not a very good idea. But there's nothing wrong with aiming for something that's going to elevate and sustain, so you might not think you have a big idea to begin with, but if that idea lives on beyond your 1 month social media campaign, then you've hit on something. And finally, for me, that big idea, it's that when you're around the table with your creative team and you're having that brainstorm and you get that little feeling on your hair sticks up a little bit because you're like, we've got something, like we're onto something here. And that's when you're starting to kind of get something that's a bit bigger than just, a solution. There's nothing wrong with solutions, but sometimes...
A big idea is bigger than that.
Yeah.
So, Jakob, what's your feeling about scalability and big ideas?
Well, I think one thing is talking about big ideas, but I think we also have to talk about in which way. And I think, for me, what I've seen is big ideas solve two problems. One, obviously, it serves, if it's done right, as one of those certain notions of common references that you can create. You can do it with Game of Thrones, but the rest of the cultural communication industries suffering from this kind of fragmentation where no one has the joint references. And I feel like big ideas is probably one of those instruments that can help brands get there. And the reason why I'm saying an instrument is because I've also seen what a big idea can do to a company internally if it's done right. If you take the Epic Splitter, or if you take the marriage market, or other of these kind of like classic halo campaigns, one thing is obviously having an extremely transformational value externally that have built unprecedented level of expectations externally, meaning that it's kind of like a stepping stone for how you actually start engaging with consumers, so not the end game in itself, but also how that suddenly changes the way that the company sees itself. And it serves also as that kind of like joint reference between consumers and brands that also starts driving something else, which I think is really important, which is this commitment to actually fulfill expectations. So I feel like I totally agree. I think it's not about big ideas. Maybe it's more like ideas, but in a big way.
Exactly.
But the impact that it will have has to be twofold: transformational internally, and obviously also transformational in the context of how consumers are driving expectations towards what you say.
And I think that's a good point. What he's saying is the context of that idea. We come from a mentality that a big idea has to be fully connected to the content. But when we think of content today, the way it is, the more content, the better. That's how people are thinking. But then it becomes a little bit of a clutter, right? So content equals to clutter when it's not meaningful, when it's not connected to the audience. And I think today we are at a time where we can actually connect back to the core of what the idea is supposed to be doing, which is connecting meaningfully with an audience. And that is what will create those actionable reactions from them, right? So we talk about engagement, we talk about all those terminology, but sometimes we forget about what that really means. And what a big idea is supposed to be driving is making people move, right? Making people take an action, making people change their own lives, supposed to be, it sometimes could be. And that is when we are fully connected to that audience. So that level of understanding of an audience first needs to be there before we even start thinking that we should be creating ideas.
So how do we connect with that audience? Is it a data-driven solution, or how much role does creativity play in elevating a small idea to a big idea?
Yeah, I think data and insight can give you a framework for an idea. It's a good starting point. I think people become, we're all very obsessed with the idea of big data and what it can do with us, for us now. But I think in a marketing context, you need that framework. You need to know who you're going to talk to. You need to know sort of something about the wider environment, that the client, in my case, I'm trying to solve a marketing problem for them. I'm trying to help them meet a business objective. I need to know all those things. I need to know sort of what the sandbox I'm playing in. But then from that, creativity must come. You can't just sort of crunch numbers and think, well, if I do like a video with this person, then I'm going to get X amount of engagement. Start with the framework, start with the insight, and then brainstorm the thing. Because if you've got the context, if you know, to your point, you've got to know who that audience is. You've got to know who you're talking to. Because actually, something that struck me, I've listened to a lot of the talks here yesterday and today. And, AI, everyone's talking about AI and the technology that's coming, and, it's here and it's going to allow for so much more kind of targeting. And I think if we're not careful, we're going to forget that there's a human being at the end of all that. We can personalise, but there's a human being that we've got to connect with, and you can only do that through actually speaking to them with an idea that's going to resonate. We've got to speak to each other as human beings still. Technology is great. It's going to allow us to talk to a lot more people in a lot more targeted way.
So I'll come back to the context of the audience first, but in context of the brand and the big idea, how much can a brand buy into a big idea? How much can they license an influencer, bring in a big idea from scratch? Or how much do they have to grow that relationship between them and the audience to do with providing content and setting up that expectation from the audience that this brand is someone who talks their content to them in a meaningful way?
For me, I think it's the key to probably the issue that most brands are suffering from, which is basically lack of expectations. And the reason why that is interesting is that the arena on which they're basically negotiating their right to play or not is in the same arena as everything else is in the arena of cultural consumption. If we accept the fact that advertising, when it's done well, is consumed exactly the same way as any other kind of cultural artifact, it also forces you to accept that the rules for how you're becoming relevant and how you sustain a position as providing valuable content or experience in that space have changed. So, I mean, like, a lot of the work that we do is basically trying to teach or discuss with some of those, mastodons, that they need to have the same kind of like market perspective on their advertising as they have on their products. Because once they adopt that kind of thinking, they also start to put much more effort and get their hands dirty when it comes to understand the market in which they're actually competing. And once you have that kind of like understanding, you can also start actually, leveraging data from building competitiveness rather than, looking for another silver bullet. And the problem is the level of complexity in this whole ecosystem is so high that, essentially we all know that there are millions of ways that we can get to a certain point, but the problem is that there is no direction. So I think having direction, I think we're going to be discussing that, and engagement is also like one of the issues. But if you have a very clear idea of where you are potentially like to put yourself in the market for conversations, and start developing a plan as you would for actually launching a product to sit in that space, you'll suddenly see that all these levers that you're sometimes using in the silos has a whole different value, at least from a data perspective. So I think understand your consumers as if you're selling them a product.
And have a long-term plan and understand the consequence of success. Because once you've delivered one successful campaign, you're only going to fall if you don't deliver against those expectations. The audience. So how do we define the context of the audience, and how do you make that content relevant to them? So we were talking about Volvo Trucks before, and you were involved in the epic split, and you were telling me that it took a number of pieces of content to get to that place. But we were also talking to a truck buying audience there. However, that particular video went viral and went way beyond that. Was the halo effect that it went back to Volvo consumer cars, or was the halo effect that Volvo Trucks will be immortalised as the truck brand to buy from for the future? And which is more valuable?
Well, I think it actually refers back to the problem of not having access to consumer expectations, right? So that video obviously was a manifestation of the product that everyone wanted to do, because that product experience at the same time. But essentially what it did was not delivering a message. It was giving Volvo access to context in which they could negotiate that position. And I mean, like, the interesting part about that project is obviously that they took them 2 years to get there, where they were building a nobody truck brand from scratch to something that everyone perceived as something that it needed to be interested in from a publisher perspective, from an audience perspective. So when we launched that first part of that campaign, we were basically pushing publishers to pick up on something as ridiculous as a truck ad. 2 years in, they were actively pushing to be part of that next launch because they know it had a viability within audiences. So that's back to the expectations. And I actually also feel it comes very much to what we discussed in relatability. Like, once you accept that there is another way of being relatable, or there's another way of winning, you also have to accept that it's kind of like a one-way street. You cannot do 10%, fantastic experience with consumers while doing 90% mediocre work that kind of like just brings you down or even below the expectations that you had when nobody even gave a shit about who you were.
Yeah, and that brings a good point, which is once we understand what the context of that is, like once you really fully understand that, your point A, your point B, right? You know where you need to start and where you need to finish. And to your point, some ideas are actually so good that the recreation of that big idea is the extension of it. And then we get to a point where we understand exactly what we created and how impactful that was. There's no need to recreate what was already created. So a lot of brands are actually extending that big idea into the next level, what the next level will be. Right? So that is what audience is expecting from us. So, and when we fully understand what that audience is, where they're coming from, what they're doing, we are creating campaigns that are meaningfully based on context. We are today at a time where people actually understand what we're doing and not just clicking for clicking. So we're still talking about a lot of engagement and how we engage people. But sometimes we forget that engagement is asking people to take more than one action. So when they take the second action, what are we actually really asking them to do? So we're creating a path, we're creating a journey, but we have to give them what the end result is. They need to know where they're going, what they're doing.
The consumer does.
The consumer needs to know. If the brand objective is not in place, the consumer will get lost, and that engagement means nothing to them, right?
So yeah, how do you measure success? You know, we talk about deeper engagement. Is that enough?
I guess for me and the work we do at the Economist Group, we're very much, and I'm going to use a really wanky term, but we're at the top of the funnel because a lot of what we do is thought leadership, and it's research-based, and it's trying to talk to a very kind of top-tier audience of senior people, C-suite people who they're not ultimately going to be the ones who are like clicking to buy the thing. They're going to have the big strategy, and then that will trickle down within their organisation. But I think ultimately we're all in this business to promote some sort of action. You know, it's marketing after all. I can be as fancy pants about it as I want. You know, I want someone to do something. I want my client to feel like they've got the return on investment. So engagement, yes, for me, it's all about have I done my job? Have I created content that is interesting, engaging, informative enough that someone is willing to give me 5 minutes of their time to read it? If I get that, you know, we get sort of high dwell times, good completion rates. If I've achieved that, then maybe I've planted the seed in that person's mind that then when they get further down the funnel, they will have, you know, something else, some other piece of marketing when they're ready to have that sales message. That is then when somebody else worries about that. But
so it becomes more holistic.
Yeah.
Whereas you could also say that a big idea is so big that it plows through that 360-ness of it, and it becomes its own solution.
I think, to me, it's back to what's the end game, and essentially, it's about driving sales, at least for the stuff that we do. But I've been in the media sales business for 6 years, so I love all those KPIs that's open for interpretation. But what I love about engagement as such is, for many companies, it's not the end game, but it's a North Star in terms of behavioral change within the organization. Because, essentially, and we can tell that from I think a lot of the conversations that have been going on today, also that we saw yesterday, where people are starting to take control back, meaning that they also suddenly embodying an immense amount of complexity that they probably haven't foreseen when they started that endeavor. And sometimes in order to actually drive progress, you need simplicity and direction. And I feel like just aiming for something that, that is rooted in actually animating consumer behavior, or in which form engagement is going to take, is a great North Star for many. Because I mean, like, what we're seeing here, and I think we've been seeing in this conference, is obviously we are portraying the perfect worlds, but and this is a good thing, is that most marketeers are not even on the they're still just trying to get a direction to where they want to go. So even though we can start to talk about what is the perfect idea, what's the perfect setup, I feel like there is just need for a simplicity and a direction for many to take those first steps into accepting that they are basically participating in a market of conversations, but they're not even close to competing.
So that's interesting. So Jakob's talking about a North Star, and you at Storyful have a very fast turnaround where you have to deliver immediate solutions to your brands. And you don't have the luxury.
But that's exactly it. And you start with a good point, which is we are here to create campaigns that will somehow drive some type of sales, right? Whatever conversion that is, right? Whatever the ROI for the client is. So we need to get to that point, to that level. And there are two ways to do that. So one way is when we look at a product and we are taking the facts of those products, and it's easy to understand. I need shampoo and I need to take a shower, so I need to get clean. People will buy products just for that reason. But there's another way to create ideas, which is based on emotional facts, right? So there's a way to create emotional reactions for people. There's a way to connect them emotionally to the product. It's no longer just taking the shower for the functionality of it, but they're actually loving the product. They're actually loving what they do. They're loving the experience of what they are having at that moment. So when we are thinking of ideas on the Storyful side, we are thinking of the authenticity, the truth of that idea, and we're trying to create those emotional connections with them. So we basically create ideas based on, for the most part, based on user-generated content, because that's the way that we felt that people are more related to the content that they are actually their own creators. So we know everybody's creating so much content today. Just on YouTube alone, you can, and by the facts and by the numbers, 432,000 pieces of videos are uploaded on a daily basis, just on YouTube. So everybody's creating, they're their own creators, but they're creating for emotional reasons. So everybody wants to be emotionally connected to either to the content that they're creating or to the content that they're seeing in front of them.
But that's not a big idea. If it's UGC, you're actually borrowing somebody else's idea and fitting it into a plan rather than creating this huge North Star to aim for.
So UGC is actually the way that we are showing the big idea, the way that we are portraying the big idea. It could have been through produced content. It could have been through a mix of those two. And the big idea is what's behind it, right? It's what's driving that. So we do create big ideas based on big ideas as well. A lot of people are uploading so much beautiful and cool content every single day. Brands are trying to pick back on what's already existing, right? So, and a lot of brands are coming to Storyful today because they want to be more truthful, they want to be more authentic, they want to be more related to their consumers, they don't know how. So UGC is one way to do that. We can go back to scripting and we can create reasons why a brand should go and produce the content, but there are other ways to do that today. So there are small, short, turnaround ideas as well. So, and to your point, to your question, some brands will come to Storyful and they will need a big idea by next week. And we would have to somehow figure out a way to provide that big idea for them. Whether they will live on a social media channel for 3 months, for a whole year, or it's for a week, we still consider that as a big idea because we took the same process, follow the same models, and we came up with the same solutions for them. It's not just solution-driven, but at this point, we are looking at how many emotional connections we were actually able to create.
So that's relatable content, and I still feel
relatable.
there's so much of a tug of war between relatable content over here and the big idea over there.
Well, actually, I think I think this is a good example of what it means to be market-oriented in your approach to actually, coming out with a big idea. Because the thing is, a big idea in itself is not going to take you anywhere if it's not rooted in the landscape in which you're going to be competing from a conversational perspective.
Yes,
and I think also, secondly, again, as I said before, yes, we need North Stars, but the days where digital was simple was the days where you can actually, do a YouTube hit, because there was one currency that for just a couple of years basically aligned everyone around an acceptance that there's an indicator of what true success will look like, which was the YouTube count until it wasn't anymore, right? And today, that kind of, let's say, that's kind of like one hit wonder. It can never stand alone, meaning that you need a context in order to carry even the big ideas forward. And that's why I think it's interesting to see that, it's the same approach, rather you aim for that great halo notion of common reference effect that you can build maybe once or two in your brand lifetime, if you get it right. 90% don't, because they missed the whole process, they get lost in the process. But it all starts with having a very, very clear understanding of what are you up against, and that starts by understanding your market.
Okay, so I'm going to ask each of you, can you tell me a campaign which involves a big idea in context, which was successful for a relatable audience? Angela?
Do you know what? I was thinking about this, and it was more a kind of piece of guerrilla marketing, actually. It's the Fearless Girl, the State Street, the investment bank in New York. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. They created a sculpture of a girl, and they, in the middle of the night, put it in front of the raging bull on Wall Street. And everyone woke up in the morning and there was a little girl standing there proud in front of, the biggest, symbol of masculinity and on capitalism on Wall Street. And it was supposed to be a temporary thing. It was supposed to be a stunt almost, but it actually took on bigger meaning because, contextually it was right as well. Sort of people were starting to talk about the gender pay gap, women in the boardroom, Me Too, those kind of things. It's now going to have a permanent home in New York. It won a shit ton of things it can. And it's taken on a life of its own. And I think because it was a big idea, it was bold, it was great, but it's also relatable on lots of levels. And I think for that, it's quite a great thing.
I mean, like I was, you know, I was caught off guard when you asked me the first time on the phone. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking of it, and I actually think, you know, if you'd asked me half a year ago, I would refer to one of those big brand-defining moments that we're trying to help advertisers orchestrate, because that would be kind of like the first step into that endeavor of being, you know, relatable internally and external. But it, you know, the more I kind of like digged into it, I was actually, you know, very much in love with Nothing Beat a Londoner, which is an Adidas campaign that came out not too long ago. And I think the reason why is it actually shows what is, I think, a lot of people is going wrong, which is, you know, that they're actually extremely relatable to a few, and it's rooted very, very much in a deep research that you know, that reflects that they both understand the market for the conversations in which they will not just participate but compete and win in. Mm-hmm. But it also shows that there is another mechanism which I think a lot of people is missing out on. That is the thing about being inclusive. But the only way that you could basically be inclusive is to be something for the few and not for the many, and that made it basically relatable to the masses. Whereas I think a lot of other things that we see is trying to do the obvious.
So it began from a core audience, and actually because it was so strong, it had a.
And secondly, you know, and it relates back to actually the other thing is also about pedigree. Essentially, you need to, from Adidas, you know, this is not, you know, that is part of their end game. They build authority in the market. They have, you know, been challenging, and so they are basically leading that conversation more than they're trying to just get in there and challenge, which is what we're seeing 90% of other brands attempting and accepting that participating is just good enough. They're going all in, and that takes, you know, that requires that they're getting their hands dirty and have skin in the game, which I think we are not seeing enough of.
Ansel?
I think to defend my thesis,
yeah, go on.
that big ideas can actually be created for social media. There are two cases that I actually really like, and I think I could use it. One is Cheers. Last year they created a campaign called Good Goes Round. It was a very successful campaign. They created mainly on the traditional way. When we create a big idea, the first thing that we think of is a TVC. So let's think of that 30-second spot, and let's think how we can bring it down to 15 seconds. Now, big idea is in place. Everybody's happy. Campaign is successful. I want to put that big idea into my social media channels. Is that going to work, right? Now, adapting a big idea to a social media channel, what Cheers did was, I wanted to go to my social media channels, but I want to be relatable. I want to make sure that I understand my audience. My audience is not going to like what they saw on TV, right? They would react to it differently. So they came to Storyful and they asked us to rethink and recreate that big idea into what would be the big idea.
For those people not in the States, what was the idea behind the spot?
The idea was, so they wanted to create 1 million acts of good. And so they looked at the shape of Cheers, which is a round shape, and they wanted to look at content that churned around and round and round. So that's basically what the commercial is about. So then what we did is we created a big idea and we looked for content. First of all, Storyful is a company in that we will look for user-generated content all over the world. And then we will be able to license that content, make sure that it's verified and brand safe, right? So then what we did is we looked for content that had that same format, the same shape, but using people instead of objects, right? And we found a huge amount of people all over the world, they're actually doing that on their own without knowing why. So we collected that and we created a new version of that commercial and went on social media, got so many hits, and it was a very successful campaign. So they understood now at this moment that they need to really understand the audience, and it's just migrating a TV commercial wouldn't work.
And the big idea is actually then scalable across platform, not necessarily across time or territories.
But now as a brand, we know better, right? And we know that we can just push things in front of people socially, or we can actually talk to them in the way they expect us to. And another good idea that I think was a big idea as well, to the short term that big idea was, American Express created an idea which was they wanted to show people how to use the blue title, but they wanted to make sure that people would be understanding the moment where they were adulting. Right, so your first car, your first anything. So the way that they did it, instead of just putting moments in front of people, they went on Facebook API and they wanted to see which moments were trending. So then they would respect that. You know, it's not what they thought it would be. It's exactly what the audience was actually living and wanting.
Yeah.
So it was an idea that was lived socially, but for them that was a big idea that created culture and got people to move. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We've got a little bit of time. So anyone got any questions for the panel about big ideas and context?
So thank you for the discussion. Very interesting. In terms of big ideas, so one thing is to talk about the big idea. The campaign is live, so it has been done. It's great. It wins Cannes Lions, like a girl, fearless girl, whatever. I'm more interested in terms of before that in organizations. So what are the kind of ingredients that allow you to come with the big idea, and as an organization, as a brand, so in my case Toyota, or do you identify those ideas? Because there are so many ideas that I'm personally looking at every day, but probably that don't make it. So I'm curious.
I think it's a crucial question, and I think what is not being done enough is basically doing the basic due diligence or feasibility analysis to how are you actually geared to potentially even work in the process of getting to launching a big idea. Because what we've seen a lot is obviously that once you are at a point where you manage to actually successfully drive a certain level of attention, you have a lot of organizations that internally don't have the capabilities to grasp that opportunity. I remember back in the days we said viral is not the success, that's the state of opportunity and where the real work starts. And I think the biggest issue is many organizations, at least the ones that we work with, is shit scared, to be honest, of getting their hands dirty. They've been used to having models where everyone has been basically feeding them with recommendations and suggestions and been living in this hope of the one push of a button campaign approach. And suddenly they realized that the reason why they've been losing their audience over the last 10 years is probably because they didn't do the efforts of setting themselves up success. And that starts with understanding, what are the obstacles internally in the organizations. And the thing is, when you have a global audience, which some brands do, you also have markets with, extremely autonomous opinions on what is relevant or not. And I think a lot of the things that people make, the mistakes that they make is that they build central ideas and they stretch them into local executions rather than, doing the early work on understanding, what is local relatable, what is relevance locally, feedback, and then gear the projects for that, to be relevant once it's, so aligning on relevance early stage instead of building and then stretching on the late stage. And that can only be done by having your hands much more into the mold early stage and also spending your time integrating. We're seeing silos, we're seing processes being broken into pieces.
I'm going to have to stop you because you have a flight to catch. I don't want you to
that's true.
We can tell you.
So thank you. I'm sorry there's not any more time for questions, but thank you to my panelists. It was really interesting chatting with you. We could have gone on for hours and really got into this subject, but thank you for listening to us as we touched on the top of this subject.